So our first presenter is Quentin Chiotti. Dr. Quentin Chiotti has been working in the field of climate change risk and resiliency for almost 30 years as an academic, for the nonprofit sector, for different levels of government, and for the private sector. Currently, Dr. Chiotti is practice lead climate risk and resilience at Matrix Solutions and teaches a climate risk course at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. Before joining Matrix Solution, Quentin was senior advisor, sustainability and subject matter expert, climate risk and resiliency at Metrolinx from 2015 to 2021. So thanks again, Quentin, for joining us, and I'll pass the mic to you.
Great, thank you, Dan. So the title of my presentation, Applying a Relative Measure of Likelihood to Climate Risk Assessment, PI-VC High-Level Screening Guide at the Municipal Asset Level. I do want to give a shout out to my colleagues and co-authors, David Van Vliet, Tara Romuliotis, and Melanie Ivy Sampson. Sorry, that was dry mouth. That wasn't difficulty in pronunciations. Before I go to the next slide, don't run ahead of me, Claire, is that I do want to provide a traditional land acknowledgement. Acknowledge that the land I'm presenting from in Toronto is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land and share responsibility for its stewardship. Next slide. So when I go through the PI-VC high-level screening guide, the list of how and where the process can be applied really stands out to me, especially in regards to activities that pertain to municipal decision-making, such as the operation and maintenance of infrastructure, asset management, and also climate vulnerability and risk assessment. Another part of the high-level screening guide that stands out is the probability scoring method, which struck me as a major improvement over alternative methods that have been widely adopted elsewhere across the climate change community. This got my colleagues and I thinking about likelihood scoring methods and their role in helping municipal decision makers better understand climate risks. And we found this to be the case during the process to develop a climate adaptation plan for the city of Guelph, where our approach has been to apply a climate risk assessment onto infrastructure assets and the services that they provide. It is our experience that the high-level screening guide probability scoring method strongly resonates with municipal decision makers. Next slide. So why is this the case? When we look at alternative scoring methods, likelihood scales can be challenging to understand, if not confusing, especially when you're having to compare future projections to historical conditions. The result is confusing method 1 plus confusing method 2 equals a confused stakeholder with an unrelatable understanding of climate risks. Next slide. Not only does the same situation occur in examples of municipal climate adaptation plans, but there is in fact a wide variation in how likelihood is defined and applied when you actually scope out, examples of municipal climate adaptation plans. For example, at one extreme, likelihood can be presented qualitatively, or in some cases, none at all. While at the other extreme, likelihood can follow the IPCC method, which is difficult to get your head around. And even in the case of plans that adopt the ICLEI-BARC framework, which is being widely adopted across the country among municipalities, we found that there is no consistency and subtle differences can occur. For example, we found that the likelihood rating for possible to rare can be marginally different, when the likelihood may arise once in 5 years versus once in 10 years, or unlikely during the next 10 plus years or during the next 25 years. So for some decision makers, such differences may not be significant, but to someone who is operating, maintaining, and managing infrastructure assets, which are vulnerable to climate hazards that accelerate deterioration, how one defines likelihood can become critically important. Next slide. Using alternative methods to calculate likelihood seems to be okay when the climate risk assessment exercise is high level. So for many municipalities in particular, or especially, that may work fine, such as when your impact statements are thematic or aligned with goals, involve numerous departments, result in a wide range of actions, and are informed by an array of plans, policies, and strategies. I note that among what I would call the first generation of municipal climate risk assessments, that infrastructure assets and services and asset management plans were considered amongst the mix, but not generally prominently addressed. Across municipal climate adaptation plans, the types of actions can be numerous and wide-ranging, involving planning, communications, operations, etc., and where asset management can get lost in the shuffle. So for example, the number of actions that I've seen across different municipal action or adaptation plans have ranged from around 50 to well over 400. So how do you get your head around such a range of actions and make it meaningful and achievable within a planning context? But if the focus is on infrastructure assets and the services they deliver, then there is a stronger common thread that ties impacts and actions together around operations and maintenance, around asset management, and presents an opportunity for the high-level screening guide probability scale to play a more prominent role. Next slide. In recent years, the integration of climate change into asset management planning is also becoming more prominent as a legislative requirement in Ontario, but it is also beginning to appear on the radar in other jurisdictions, agencies, and in the private sector. In this context, I would like to acknowledge the good work being done by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, FCM, and also by ICLEI as examples of this trend. And I want to highlight the work being done by FCM in particular and their fact sheets that provide a clear and concise pathway as you work your way through the risk assessment process, from considering climate hazards through to identifying resiliency actions for key types of infrastructure. Next slide. Now, I don't expect you to soak in all that what's on this very populated table, but they are examples of different types of infrastructure and how to manage climate risk through enhanced asset management as articulated by the FCM fact sheets. This slide provides further detail when the focus is on infrastructure assets as it applies to climate hazards, asset failure, impacts to levels of service, and indirectly the costs associated with response measures. Of note is the focus on operations and maintenance, on renewal and even replacement options, which can then be further refined as taking action on adaptation, on mitigation, or on actions that generate co-benefits for both. And from our experience, I think this is a good way of trying to bring together the race to zero, which many municipalities have given a higher priority relative to the race of resiliency, into one comprehensive approach. Next slide. So this comes back to the role of likelihood in fostering our understanding of risk. And this slide outlines the likelihood probability method adopted in the high-level screening guide in all of its glory and all of its detail. So I find that when you try to get your head around looking at the relatable and relative likelihood of future climate conditions compared to the past, that this is actually a method that is much more relatable to decision makers amongst municipalities. And it has been our experience that the probability scoring method adopted in the high-level screening guide is an effective method that resonates with municipal decision makers who are responsible for the operation, maintenance, and management of infrastructure assets. So the question is, why does it resonate? And operations and maintenance activities tend to be focused on the here and now. They tend to be temporally more immediate, and at best, looking ahead through capital planning cycles, perhaps 5 or 10 years into the future. And there is also historical experience that is hard to ignore even though as science-based practitioners, we are taught to preach that past experience is not a good indicator of future conditions. But when you own, operate, and manage infrastructure assets, the reality is that history matters. Next slide. So to what extent then is the past a good or bad indicator of the future, especially when recent extreme weather events that can fall well outside of the realm of normal probability, such as a 1 in 500 year event, or even multiple 1 in 500 year events have occurred or reoccur, and in some cases are not even captured in climate change projections. As weather and climate becomes warmer, wetter, and wilder, we can expect that extreme events and their impacts on infrastructure assets will be experienced by more and more decision makers, and that these experiences will greatly influence their perceptions of future risk. So perhaps a pragmatic pathway forward is the combined experience with past extremes, with future projections, noting that the unexpected is still possible and that bad history can repeat itself. So this places great importance on the relative change in likelihood. Next slide. And this is just one theoretical example that I'd like to share with you, noting that relativity, when you try to understand future climate relative to the past, has some challenges that you need to note. So this is a practical example of the likelihood scoring method. In one case, when the risk score is high, and another when the risk score is medium, if you're doing a municipally based climate adaptation, vulnerability, and risk assessment. Heavy rainfall and flooding has a high score in this example of 16. Culverts are at high risk, for example, where there is increased flood risks associated with the likelihood increasing between 10 and 50%. One would expect that the municipal response might be to increase operations and maintenance resources and procedures and put in place higher design standards when constructing new stormwater management systems. In the case of freeze-thaw cycles that are projected to become less frequent, dealing with potholes and rolled surfaces that are at medium risk or a risk score of 6, decision makers are facing decreased costs for repairs, since likelihood will decrease between 10 and 50%, and as a result will not appear with a risk score of 6 as a high risk that requires attention as an outcome of the risk assessment. So typically when you're doing risk assessment exercise, it's the high or the very high risk that you focus on, and all the medium risks and the low risks tend to get brushed aside. So how does that apply in a asset management context? Based on historical experience and current practice, let's say repairing potholes, for example, may already be a significant problem that city staff are managing well, and thus changes in practices and budgets in the immediate future may not be necessary. The issue then becomes where tweaking of O&M, asset management, and capital planning budgets as required. Do their needs increase? Do they decrease as projected? Next slide. Final thoughts. I would make the case that the PIVC high-level screening guide and the likelihood scoring method can be an effective tool in informing municipal climate adaptation planning, especially for assessments that focus on infrastructure assets. And while this may be an important improvement in itself, it could also become an important step towards taking a deeper dive into incorporating climate change impacts into asset management planning. In the latter case, we should acknowledge the great work being done by and for the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario and the potential further application of the high-level screening guide probability scoring method, if not the overall guide process itself. Next slide. If you have any questions or care to follow up, don't hesitate to contact me directly.
Great, thank you very much, Quentin.